So let's talk about decision making. Decision making is super important in your organization because how decisions are made actually has a huge impact on the extent to which they are implemented and implementable, right? And so a couple of things that you'll want to think about in advance, especially when you are considering using a group for decision-making purposes or making a decision with a group, are things related to the style that you want to use. So let me talk you through this. There are a couple of different things that you probably want to begin by doing related to decision making. The first one is decide what the appropriate decision style is. So some examples of decision style are things like voting or flipping a coin, right? Those are tricky because there's kind of winners and losers, right? If you like that kind of stuff, no problem. If it works, it works. But there are also ways to think about it that have to do with consideration of who has the right to make the decision and also enough information to make the decision, and then take into consideration how much support you need in implementation of a decision. And so what you might want to think about at the outset is, if I have a decision to make, am I willing and able to make an autocratic decision? Autocratic is I have the right to make the decision and I have enough information to make the decision. And me making the decision alone is going to be a time saver, and the consequences as far as implementation are low, right? I also have an option of a more consultative style. So a consultative style is where I consult with other people. I still retain and have the right to make the decision, but I consult with people. I might consult with people one-on-one, or I might bring people together as a group and do consultation where I still remain in control and possessing the right to make the final decision. The one thing that I encourage you to think about with consultative decision making is, once I get a whole bunch of folks in a room and we have a decision-making conversation, oftentimes people believe that we are in a consensus decision-making space, right? So if I am going to use a consultative approach where I retain the right to make the final decision, I need to let people know we are here together to explore our options, to make sure that we have a lot of perspectives informed, to make sure that we share ownership in the final decision, and that we have the kind of buy-in that we need early on to make sure that we're able to implement the decision. But I need to be the final decision maker. And as long as you communicate that effectively and clearly in advance, people typically get it. It's your job to make this decision. So a lot of times people don't have a rub with me making or you making the final decision. What they don't like is thinking it's consensus, and then all of a sudden you make a decision, and or you make a decision that is not at all what they expected based on the conversation that they participated in, right? And so if you're going to use a consultative style, which is absolutely fine, just make sure that you're clear and you're explaining it to people. The other style, or another style of decision making, is called a consensus style. And this is where a group of people come together to build a decision, right? So a definition of consensus is where a group of people who are key stakeholders build a decision together that each member of that group can support and agree to, and that they're willing to commit to in implementation, even if it's not their very first choice, right? So consensus is tricky because it means that everyone is saying yes. And so sometimes there are tools associated with helping a group, especially large groups where there's a lot of probability for dissenting points of view, to come to consensus. But I actually don't think it's the most practical decision-making model. One of the tools, though, associated with this section is called the gradients of agreement. So for those of you who are interested in having consensus-like decisions, then what you can do is use the gradient of agreement to help you have a description of how much agreement is needed, and still make sure that people are weighing in yes to the extent that they're able to implement and say that they will agree with the decision, right? So we have a tool that's specifically associated in this section with consensus decision making that gives a little bit more structure than everybody loves it or it's not going to happen, which is oftentimes what people think are the only options related to consensus. Okay, so let's go forward and think about decision making in a group. What I want to describe here is just what decision making looks like from a process point of view. There is a model that really describes participatory decision making. So if you are leading decision making within a group, you need to know about a participatory decision making model because it occurs over and over and over again. This is probably something that you've experienced if you've gone through a strategic planning process, for example, or in change management. It's a typical group decision-making process, so you need to know the different zones of activity. And it looks like a diamond. So in this section, below this section, is actually a visual that looks like a diamond that we kind of lovingly call the decision-making diamond. And it comes from the work of Sam Kainer, who's a really expert facilitator around group decision-making. And basically what happens in this participatory decision-making is that there are different zones of activity that exist. The very first is a topic identification. At the beginning of a decision-making process, what you need to know is what is the topic that we're actually focused on? What is the problem we are trying to solve? What is the decision that we are trying to make? That sounds like something that can be implied and move through quickly. Please don't do that. Stop, pause, clarify. The doggonedest thing happens when people just all start solving a problem and then realize mid-course or 6 months into something that's really significant that we've all been working with different definitions. So pause at the beginning of your process and say, let's make sure that we're on the same page with the topic or the problem or the decision or the scope. Stop right there. Then what happens, and you can see the visual associated with the image underneath of this section, is that we have a section that is really about kind of opening up the possibilities. It's called the divergent zone. In the divergent zone, what we're doing is we are generating ideas and alternatives. We are expressing different points of view. We're encouraging dissenting points of view, right? We want to hear from people and ideas that may or may not work, or may or may not be popular, or may or may not be predicted. I would rather, if I am the facilitator or manager of a group going through this process, hear about things that are dissenting points of view as early on in the process as possible, right? I don't want to wait until it's time to implement and go live and then all of a sudden hear about someone's dissenting point of view that never saw the light of day because we didn't make room for it. So encourage and surface dissenting points of view as early as possible. It will also lead you to have more creative experiences and possibilities, right? Because creativity requires dissenting points of view. So actually soliciting alternatives and alternative ideas about how we can approach something actually leads us to having more creative options or strategies for moving forward. The other thing that you want to do during the divergent zone is really kind of unpack and make sure that you are listening and having inclusive space for hearing from all the points of view around a decision-making table. And so you might use very specific facilitation tools in order to make sure that you're hearing from everyone in ways that allow all of those voices to be heard authentically and in ways that are substantive. And I mentioned this before, but I'll happily let you know again that if you ever need additional tools or want additional resources for facilitation, we are happy at the DJA team to bring those to you or to share those with you. We actually have a facilitation skills workshop and also skilled facilitators who can help coach you. Let me move forward now to the convergent zone. The convergent zone follows the divergent zone. So once you've unpacked and you have a lot of ideas that you're exploring, then you move into the divergent zone. And the divergent zone is where you start to winnow down the ideas that have been presented and are being explored, right? And this is really important, but it's also messy. There are all sorts of people who write about things called the messy middle. The messy middle is moving through a process where we have a lot of ideas and now we're trying to focus in on a more narrow possible options for action, right? That transition from divergent to convergent is tricky, right? And it's always tricky for the facilitator, it's tricky for the manager, but do it anyway. It's really important that you let the group expand and that you help the group contract because that is the natural process. Even if it doesn't always feel good, because people don't often like process, your job is to drive the group forward, right? And to know that that little awkward pause there is absolutely typical. In the convergent zone, you are sorting ideas, you are applying the ideas against the previously identified criteria for making the decision, you're fine-tuning your own thinking, you're arriving at conclusions, right? And so you're really pulling things together so that you have a much smaller and more finite group of options to explore. Then the last piece of this, or the second to the last piece, is called the closure zone. And the closure zone is where you step back and consider, okay, of all the possibilities that we've explored and applied against our criteria, which one or ones are most viable for us? Which are the ones that we actually want to commit to? That's the place where you make some agreements about a course of action. And then the very, very final thing that you do is you say, okay, we are going to implement a decision rule. We are going to decide that we are going to go this direction or that direction. You have probably arrived at that decision in the closure zone, but you want to be really explicit about it in the decision point to let people know very clearly, we have officially decided that we are going to do this and not that, and also the associated next steps, right? And so some of the things that you might want to take into consideration as far as communication in this stage are really making sure that people understand what needs to be done and who will do it, and by when are we making the commitment, and the resources that we'll need in order to allow us to move forward. Also in this section are some templates for you kind of thinking through the different stages of a decision-making process in a group, and some criteria for thinking about what decision rule you might use, just to help you reflect on, if I want to go autocratic or consultative or consensus, which might be the very best fit for the decision, and know that every decision will probably have an opportunity for a unique consideration and then decision about what decision rule you want to use. Okay, I hope that that was a real helpful way to think about decision making. Go make good decisions, and most importantly, do them well.